Saint Irenaeus and the Canon. We tend to think of the biblical canon as something forged in quiet sunlit libraries by men with long white beards calmly sorting through parchment. But the boundaries of the text you might have sitting on your nightstand were actually drawn in blood, ash, and in the immediate aftermath of a horrific massacre. The year is not what matters as much as the geopolitical reality of the Roman province of Gaul. We are looking at the city of Lugdunum, which we now call Lyon, around 177 AD. At this time, the Christian community in Lyon is small, tight-knit, and under immense crushing pressure. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius is on the throne, a Stoic philosopher whose disdain for this new, stubborn sect of Christians is palpable. In the summer of 177, a localized but brutal persecution erupts. The pagan populace turns on their Christian neighbors. People are dragged into the amphitheater, tortured, and thrown to wild beasts. Among the dead is the 90-year-old Bishop of Lyon, a man named Pothinus, who dies from the abuse he suffers in prison. Now there is a younger priest in this community, a man born in Asia Minor named Irenaeus, by a sheer twist of historical fate, or what he would certainly call divine providence. Irenaeus is not in Lyon when the mob descends. He has been sent on a diplomatic mission to Rome to deliver letters to Pope Eleutherius regarding a theological dispute. He escapes the slaughter. He survives, but when he returns to Gaul, he finds a traumatized, decimated flock. His spiritual father is dead, the streets are stained with the blood of his friends, and the mantle of leadership falls squarely onto his shoulders. He is made the new Bishop of Lyon. You might assume that his primary focus would be fortifying the physical defenses of his people, hiding them from the Roman authorities, or building catacombs. But Irenaeus realizes a much more insidious threat has crept into the community while they were busy looking over their shoulders at the Roman swords. A spiritual rot is taking hold, a sophisticated, alluring intellectual movement that threatens to dissolve the very core of the faith Pothinus died for. This movement is Gnosticism. To understand the gravity of what Irenaeus does next, we have to understand the psychology of a traumatized community. When the physical world becomes a place of torture and death, a theology that tells you the physical world is inherently evil, and an illusion becomes very attractive. Gnosticism offered an escape hatch. It told believers that the flesh did not matter, that the Creator God of the Old Testament was a lesser, ignorant deity, and that the true Christ came to deliver secret, hidden knowledge to rescue the elite souls from the prison of matter. Irenaeus looks at his surviving flock and realizes that if Gnosticism wins, the martyrdom of Pothinus was meaningless. If the body does not matter, then bleeding for the truth is a fool's errand. And so, in the shadow of this trauma, Irenaeus picks up his pen to write a massive 5-volume work titled Adversus Heresies, or Against Heresies. He decides that the only way to anchor his people is to anchor the texts they read. He must draw a definitive, unbreachable line around the authentic testimony of the apostles. He must define the boundaries of the gospel. And this is where we encounter one of the most pivotal moments in the history of Western thought. Irenaeus becomes the first Christian thinker to state categorically and unequivocally that there are exactly 4 authentic gospels, and only 4. This is not a suggestion. It is a mathematical, theological, and cosmic absolute. He establishes a fortress of text to protect a vulnerable people. He builds a canon, and the way he constructs this argument, the sheer architectural genius of his defense, will ripple out across millennia, defining the shape of orthodoxy and the very concept of a closed, authoritative book. To appreciate the genius of the fourfold gospel, we have to descend into the murky, swirling waters of the 2nd century theological marketplace. We must investigate the genealogy of the Gnostic threat. By the time Irenaeus assumes his bishopric, the Christian world is awash in texts. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of documents are circulating around the Mediterranean basin, all claiming to be the authentic voice of Jesus or his apostles. You have the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Philip. The intellectual leaders of the Gnostic movement, men like Valentinus and Marcion, are charismatic, brilliant, and highly persuasive. Valentinus in particular is a master synthesizer. He was educated in Alexandria, steeped in Platonic philosophy, and he weaves an elaborate, dizzying cosmology. He teaches about a divine fullness called the Pleroma, populated by 30 eons, and a tragedy in the divine realm that leads to the accidental creation of the material universe by a flawed, ignorant being known as the Demiurge. Valentinus does not ask his followers to abandon Christianity. He asks them to graduate from it. He offers a very important person room of spirituality, a higher tier of enlightenment for those who possess the gnosis, the secret knowledge. And to support this esoteric system, his followers produce their own texts. Irenaeus specifically calls out one of these documents, noting that the Valentinians boast of possessing more Gospels than actually exist, and he names a relatively new text they circulate called the Gospel of Truth. Imagine the appeal of this for a moment. You are a 2nd century merchant in Rome, or a widow in Lyon. The Orthodox Christian message is rugged, demanding, and dangerous. It requires submission to a visible, persecuted church and belief in a God who suffered a humiliating physical death on a Roman cross. Then a Valentinian teacher comes along and whispers that the cross was just a symbol, that the physical body of Jesus was a phantasm, and that you possess a divine spark trapped in your earthly shell. They hand you a beautiful, poetic text like the Gospel of Truth, which reads more like a philosophical meditation than a historical narrative. It feels sophisticated. It flatters your intellect. This is the shadow side of the early Christian expansion. The boundaries are porous. The oral tradition is beginning to fade as the generations who knew the apostles die off. Irenaeus sees this chaotic proliferation of texts as a fatal disease. He understands that a faith without a defined textual boundary is a faith that can be molded into whatever the cultural elite wants it to be. If the Valentinians can just write a new gospel whenever they need to justify a new doctrine, then the historical anchor of Jesus of Nazareth is severed. The faith becomes a floating abstraction. Therefore, Irenaeus has to act as a theological surgeon. He has to excise the tumor of these false texts while preserving the healthy tissue of the apostolic witness. He recognizes that the defense cannot just be a game of whack-a-mole, condemning each new heretical document one by one. There are too many of them. The Gnostic printing press, so to speak, is running hot. What he needs is a positive affirmative boundary. He needs a principle of exclusion based on a profound principle of inclusion. He has to explain not just why the Gospel of Truth is wrong, but why the specific texts read in the churches of Rome, Smyrna, and Lyon are exclusively right. He has to shift the paradigm from many possible texts to a closed, unalterable collection. This is the genesis of the fourfold axiom. It is a defensive maneuver born of desperation, but executed with breathtaking intellectual confidence. The technical mechanics of Irenaeus' argument in Against Heresies are built upon a concept he calls the rule of faith, or the regular fide. Before he even gets to the number of the Gospels, he establishes the criteria for evaluating them. The rule of faith is the public, unchanging summary of the Christian message, passed down orally and preserved in the baptismal confessions of the churches. It is the storyline of God creating the world, taking on flesh in Jesus Christ to redeem the world, and promising the resurrection of the physical body. Irenaeus argues that any text claiming to be a gospel must align with this public, historically verifiable rule of faith. The Gnostic texts fail this test immediately because they preach a secret knowledge, a hidden tradition passed down through elite channels. Irenaeus counters this with the sledgehammer of apostolic succession. He points out that the Orthodox churches can trace their leadership directly back to the apostles. The apostles did not have secret teachings. They taught everything openly to the bishops they appointed. Irenaeus himself is a vital link in this chain. He was a disciple of Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna, and Polycarp was a direct disciple of John the Apostle. Irenaeus argues that if the apostles had hidden mysteries to impart, they would have imparted them to the men they trusted with the leadership of the churches, not to someone like Valentinus, who shows up decades later inventing wild cosmologies. This tactile historical pedigree is crucial. Irenaeus is essentially saying, I knew the man who knew the man who leaned on the chest of Jesus. The Gnostics have no such lineage. Their texts are orphans, disconnected from the historical community of the faithful. With this foundation laid, Irenaeus then pivots to the texts themselves. He zeroes in on the four documents that the Universal Church has consistently used in its public worship: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He recognizes that these four texts, despite their different styles and perspectives, all agree on the fundamental narrative of the Incarnation, the cross, and the bodily resurrection. They are the written embodiment of the rule of faith. But Irenaeus goes further. He does not just say that these four are the best we have or the most historically reliable. He makes a massive, audacious theological leap. He claims that the number 4 is not an accident of history. It is a divine necessity. It is built into the very fabric of the cosmos. He declares that it is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. This is a staggering claim. He takes a historical development, the gradual acceptance of these 4 specific scrolls, and elevates it to the level of ontology. He is saying that the fourfold gospel is as foundational and unchangeable as the physical laws of the universe. This moves the debate from historical quibbling to cosmic architecture. He is building an impregnable fortress around Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, making it clear to attack the number of the Gospels is to attack the creator of the world himself. We arrive now at the famous and perhaps perplexing passage in Book 3, Chapter 11 of Against Heresies. Irenaeus lays out his grand analogy for the fourfold gospel. He writes, "For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side, and vivifying men afresh." To the modern ear, this sounds almost bizarre. It sounds like an arbitrary poetic leap. Why does the number of winds dictate the number of sacred texts? But to understand the power of this argument, we have to inhabit the 2nd century mind. This is an era where the universe is viewed as deeply symbolic, interconnected, and authored by a single rational creator. For Irenaeus, the physical world is a mirror of the spiritual reality. The God who designed the earth with 4 cardinal directions, the God who orchestrates the 4 winds that blow across the Mediterranean, is the exact same God who inspired the testimony of his Son. The Gnostics were constantly trying to sever the material world from the spiritual realm. Irenaeus' argument is a direct, calculated assault on that dualism. By linking the 4 Gospels to the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 winds, he is grounding the spiritual text in the physical dirt. He is saying that the Gospel is a global, comprehensive reality. Just as the wind touches every part of the globe, the breath of the Spirit through these 4 texts gives life to the entire universal church. The fourfold nature is proof of its Catholicity, its universality. It is not a provincial secret text for a handful of elites in Alexandria. It is the atmospheric condition of the redeemed world. Furthermore, the analogy of the pillars is vital. The church is a building, and a stable, enduring structure requires 4 pillars. If you remove one, the building lists and collapses. If you add a 5th, the symmetry is destroyed and the foundation cracks. The number 4 represents stability, completeness, and total coverage. It is a geographic and architectural necessity. This argument may not satisfy a modern rationalist demanding empirical proof for why a specific papyrus fragment from Egypt should be excluded from the canon. But as a piece of theological rhetoric, it is devastatingly effective. It transforms the 4 texts from a mere collection of writings into a cohesive cosmic unit. They are not just 4 books. They are the fourfold expression of a singular, unbreakable truth. They are the 4 faces of the diamond, the 4 walls of the house of faith. Irenaeus effectively makes the number itself a doctrine. The cosmic analogy does not stop with the winds and the corners of the earth. Irenaeus digs deeper into the prophetic architecture of the Old Testament to find another fourfold structure, one that is far more mysterious and evocative. He turns to the visions of the prophet Ezekiel and the book of Revelation, specifically the imagery of the 4 living creatures surrounding the throne of God. These creatures are described as having the faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Irenaeus maps these 4 angelic beings directly onto the 4 Gospels, assigning each text a specific creature to symbolize its unique theological emphasis. This is a masterstroke of technical mechanics, synthesizing Hebrew prophecy with Christian scripture. For Irenaeus, the creature with the face of a man represents the Gospel of Matthew. Why? Because Matthew begins with the human genealogy of Jesus, rooting him firmly in the lineage of David and Abraham. It emphasizes Christ's physical, historical humanity, his incarnation into the messiness of human generations. The Gospel of Mark is symbolized by the lion. Mark's opening is abrupt, powerful, and authoritative, like a lion roaring in the wilderness with the voice of John the Baptist. It highlights the kingship, the power, and the sudden dramatic action of the Son of God. The ox, the animal of sacrifice and priestly service, is assigned to the Gospel of Luke. Luke opens in the temple with the priest Zechariah and heavily emphasizes the sacrificial priestly role of Jesus, culminating in the detailed, agonizing portrait of his suffering. Finally, the eagle, the creature that soars high above the earth, represents the Gospel of John. John's prologue ignores the earthly genealogy in the stable in Bethlehem, launching straight into the eternal, soaring theology of the pre-existent Word. It captures the divine, transcendent nature of Christ. What Irenaeus is doing here is brilliant. He is not just giving us a fun matching game, he is demonstrating that the four Gospels are not contradictory, as some critics argued, but complementary. They are a symphonic whole. The heretics tended to latch on to one aspect of Jesus and ignore the rest. The Ebionites, an early Jewish Christian sect, only used Matthew because they only wanted the human Messiah. Marcion only used a butchered version of Luke because he rejected the Jewish roots. The Valentinians heavily favored esoteric interpretations of John. Irenaeus counters this fragmentation by arguing that you need all four creatures to understand the fullness of Christ. You need the man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. To reject one is to deform the image of the Savior. The fourfold gospel is a theological ecosystem. It holds the paradoxes of the faith in perfect tension, the humanity and the divinity, the kingship and the sacrifice. The four living creatures become the guardians of orthodoxy, a cherubic vanguard protecting the completeness of the revelation. Yet, we must confront the shadow side of this magnificent structure. We must actively resist the urge to tie a neat bow around Irenaeus' argument and walk away satisfied. There is a deep, lingering tension in the assertion that there must be exactly four Gospels because there are four winds. The anti-closure here lies in the uncomfortable intersection of divine fittingness and human historical process. Irenaeus speaks as if the four Gospels dropped from heaven in a bound leather volume perfectly matched to the four corners of the compass. But the historical reality is much messier. The early church community spent decades, even centuries, debating the exact contours of the canon. Some Orthodox communities highly revered texts like the Shepherd of Hermas or the Didache. Others viewed the Book of Revelation or the letter to the Hebrews with deep suspicion. The fixing of the number at 4 was a gradual organic consensus driven as much by practical usage in liturgy as by theological deduction. The gray area is this: did God dictate the number 4 to match the winds? Or did the Church elevate the 4 most reliable texts and then retroactively find cosmic justifications for that number? If there were 5 continents known to the ancient world, would Irenaeus have found a way to justify 5 Gospels? This tension forces us to interrogate the assumptions of early Christian apologetics. Irenaeus is using the rhetorical tools of his day, the language of typology and cosmic correspondence, to defend a boundary that was urgently needed for survival. But his insistence on the mathematical absolute of 4 and no more borders on a kind of theological numerology. It locks the mystery of divine revelation into a rigid terrestrial geometry. Furthermore, what do we do with the fact that these 4 texts do, at times, present significant chronological and narrative difficulties when placed side by side? Irenaeus harmonizes them through the lens of the living creatures, but the friction between the synoptic timeline and John's timeline remains a persistent challenge. By forcing them into an inseparable quartet, Irenaeus solved the crisis of infinite, chaotic texts, but he bequeathed to the Church the enduring challenge of reading 4 different melodies as a single, coherent symphony. Let us delve back into the genealogy of truth, the physical chain of custody that gave Irenaeus the confidence to make such sweeping claims. This is perhaps the most grounded, anti-esoteric aspect of his entire project. The Gnostic systems thrived on the idea of hidden, unwritten traditions. Valentinus claimed to have received his secret doctrines from a man named Theodus, who supposedly was a secret disciple of the Apostle Paul. It is all very shadowy, very a friend of a friend told me. Irenaeus demolishes this approach by pointing to the visible, public historical reality of apostolic succession. He does not point to secret visions. He points to specific men in specific cities whose lives and deaths are a matter of public record. For Irenaeus, the guarantor of the fourfold gospel is not just the internal consistency of the texts, but the living, breathing men who guarded them. He writes with profound reverence about his own mentor, Polycarp. In a letter to a friend who was slipping into heresy, Irenaeus recalls his youth in Lower Asia, remembering exactly where Polycarp used to sit and teach, how he walked, his physical appearance, and the very words he used to describe his conversations with John the Apostle and others who had seen the Lord. This is a vivid, visceral memory. Irenaeus is essentially saying, I remember the sound of the voice of the man who heard the voice of the man who touched the side of the resurrected Christ. This unbroken chain is the ultimate refutation of the Gnostic claim to novelty. The truth is not something newly discovered by a brilliant philosopher in Alexandria. It is an inheritance and a state passed down through a family line. The four Gospels are the family documents. They belong to the household of faith, and their authenticity is verified by the elders of the household. Irenaeus extends this argument to the Church of Rome, meticulously listing the succession of bishops from Peter and Paul down to his own day. He argues that if you want to know what the apostles taught, you go to the churches founded by the apostles and see what they are currently reading and teaching. The public consistency of the Orthodox churches scattered across the empire from Gaul to Asia Minor, all reading the same four Gospels, is the empirical proof of their apostolic origin. The genealogy of the text is intimately bound to the genealogy of the bishops. The book is authenticated by the blood and sweat of the men who carry it. To truly grasp the stakes of this boundary drawing, we need a vivid analogy. Let us consider the approach of another prominent heretic of the 2nd century, Marcion of Sinope, and contrast his method with the architecture of Irenaeus. Marcion operated like a radical surgeon performing a brutal amputation without anesthesia. He looked at the Old Testament with its wrathful, jealous creator God and found it entirely incompatible with the loving, forgiving Father revealed by Jesus. His solution was simple and violent. He took a scalpel to the scriptures. He completely discarded the Hebrew Bible. He threw out Matthew, Mark, and John because they were too Jewish. He took the Gospel of Luke, carved out the infancy narrative and any references to fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, and presented this mutilated, heavily edited document as the only true gospel. Marcion wanted a clean, spiritualized, utterly novel religion severed from the messy, earthly history of Israel. Irenaeus, on the other hand, operates like a master weaver working at a massive loom. He refuses to cut the threads of history. The fourfold gospel for Irenaeus is a tapestry that intricately weaves the God of creation, the God of the patriarchs, and the God of the prophets directly into the flesh of Jesus of Nazareth. When Irenaeus looks at the ox, the symbol of Luke's gospel, he does not see a primitive Jewish superstition to be discarded as Marcion did. He sees the profound, necessary reality of blood sacrifice, the physical cost of redemption. The fourfold gospel demands the dirt of the manger, the wood of the cross, and the physical reality of the resurrection. It is an aggressively material theology. Marcion's scalpel created a theology that floated above the earth, detached and pristine. Irenaeus' tapestry forces the believer to reckon with a God who gets his hands dirty, who honors the promises made to Abraham, and who values the physical creation so much that he enters it fully. By locking in the four Gospels, Irenaeus preserves the Jewishness of Jesus. He ensures that the Christian story remains anchored in the stubborn, unyielding soil of historical reality, rather than evaporating into a cloud of generic philosophical spirituality. The battle between Marcion's scalpel and Irenaeus' tapestry was a battle for the very nature of reality itself. The cultural ripple effect of Irenaeus' victory in establishing the fourfold gospel is almost impossible to overstate. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. When Irenaeus successfully argues that the truth is public, historical, and textually bounded, he is laying the foundation for the modern concept of public knowledge. The Gnostic vision was inherently elitist. It created a two-tiered society of the spiritually enlightened pneumatics who had the secret texts and the ignorant hylux who were trapped in the material world. If Gnosticism had prevailed, Christianity would have become an esoteric mystery cult accessible only to the wealthy, educated elite who had the time and resources to be initiated into its complex cosmologies. By insisting on the four public Gospels, the same texts read aloud to slaves and senators alike, Irenaeus democratized revelation. He established that the highest truths of the universe are accessible to anyone who walks into the gathering of the church and listens to the reading of the Word. Furthermore, the concept of a canon, a fixed measuring rod of authoritative texts, creates the intellectual framework for the rule of law, constitutionalism, and even the scientific method. The idea that there is a supreme written authority against which all subsequent claims must be tested and measured is a directly inherited structural concept from early Christian canon formation. The fourfold gospel trained the Western mind to look for truth not in floating subjective spiritual experiences, but in historically grounded, publicly verified documents. The fact that you can walk into a hotel room today, open a drawer, and find a book that definitively claims to contain the foundational narrative of the world's largest religion is a direct consequence of a bishop in 2nd century Gaul refusing to yield an inch to the Valentinian philosophers. Irenaeus did not just save his local flock in Lyon, he established the parameters of orthodox thought for the next 2 millennia. He created the immovable center around which the entire theological and cultural life of the West would eventually orbit. As we pull back and examine the full scope of this massive intellectual undertaking, we see a fascinating paradox in the figure of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. His very name, Irenaeus, means the peaceable one or the peacemaker. And indeed, later in his life, he would intervene with the Bishop of Rome to prevent a schism over the dating of Easter, urging tolerance and unity. Yet this great peacemaker is remembered primarily for his fierce, uncompromising defense of the boundaries of the faith. He shows us that true peace in the community is not achieved by a vague, boundaryless tolerance of every new idea that floats through the door. True peace requires a solid floor to stand on and strong walls to lean against. He built those walls out of the texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He understood that a faith that means everything means nothing. By drawing a hard line against the Gnostic Gospels, he preserved the scandalous, beautiful, flesh and blood reality of the Incarnation. He ensured that the Church would remain tied to the earth, tied to history, and tied to the physical suffering and triumph of its founder. The 4 living creatures continued to guard the throne, and the 4 winds continued to blow across the history of the Church. The deep dive into Irenaeus reminds us that the book we hold so easily today was forged in the fires of persecution and defended with brilliant cosmic audacity. The canon is not an accident, it is a fortress. If you found value in this exploration, if this deep dive shifted the way you viewed the history of the text and the roots of our faith, I invite you to share this episode with someone else. Pass it along to a friend who loves history or theology, or just a really compelling story of intellectual survival. Share it listener to listener and keep the conversation going. The peace of Christ be upon you.